Hi everyone, this is History of Ancient Rome at Flagler College. In this video lecture I want to talk about some of the events of the first couple of centuries of the Republic, specifically two kinds of conflict. The first of these is conflict with other peoples, so Rome fighting largely against its neighbors, other peoples of central Italy, the Etruscans, the other Latins, eventually the Samnites. So that's the first kind of conflict. The second kind of conflict is the conflict within Rome itself, and this is largely along class lines, and this conflict comes to shape the Roman Republic, its political and social system, and so we can't, I think, speak enough about conflict as a driver of Roman history. First of all, as with other things in this very early period, we have the information given to us by figures like Livy, who of course was writing centuries after these events happened, but in some cases is the only history source that we have for these circumstances. And then the reality, which we can tease out to some extent with archaeology, but often we have to just kind of read between the lines in the historiography, and if we can corroborate with other sources, with material remains, and with other things to try to piece together what really happened, right? Because the point of writing these histories was not to tell things as they actually happened, but to teach lessons about how to behave, about the greatness of Rome, about the values that Rome held, and that's what you should be thinking about as you read someone like Livy. So we're picking up here at the beginning of the 5th century BCE. This is to kind of orient you in the Mediterranean context. This is around the time that Greece enters its classical age, that Greece is fighting the Persian Wars and sort of coming into its own with the polis system, if that's helpful to anyone. At that time, Rome was still just a small and, I'm not going to say insignificant city in Italy, because it was growing in power. But the Latin League, for instance, which was this organization of cities in Latium, still did not acknowledge Rome as a member or as any kind of partner. And so Rome tended to fight against the other cities of the Latin League. And they also fought against other neighbors, the Aequi and the Volsci, or the Volscians, as they're known. Provide us other wars, and Livy speaks at some length about them, as does Polybius and others. Actually, I'm not sure that Polybius gets back this far, but Livy certainly speaks about it. And the stories of these wars tend to center on these heroic figures, some of whom have become subject matter for other things. There is one figure named Coriolanus, for instance, who shows up in a war against the Volscians, and actually, after winning some victories and doing great things for the early Republic, he ends up defecting over to the Volscians, and may have been a Volscian himself, and of course Shakespeare picked up on this and wrote a tragedy about him. More impressive is the figure known as Cincinnatus, and this statue that you see here is actually of Cincinnatus. According to legend, he was a kind of retired patrician in Rome who had served the Republic, had served as consul, had lived out his life there, and then kind of retired. He was in his old age, but the Romans came and offered him the position of dictator, and we'll talk about what that is a little later. You can see here that he is at his plow, so he's out on his country estate, working the land, and they come and offer him the fasces here to go and take up the command of the Roman armies. And according to the stories, Cincinnatus did this and ended up winning a smashing victory over the Aequi. And he sort of went down in history as this great selfless servant of the Republic and all of that. And as soon as he had won that, he didn't ask for any particular reward for himself. He just went back to his country estate and said, well, it was a pleasure to serve the Republic. And so, as Livy and others tell it, this is the point, right? That these heroic figures like Cincinnatus served because it was their duty to serve, because they loved the Republic, because, you know, they were committed to this thing, not out of any desire for reward. That is a little too optimistic, I think, to swallow as a depiction of reality, right? So here, this is where we have to read between the lines. We don't know a lot about these early wars, other than that Rome was successful, and that after fighting against the Latin League, they emerged as the most prominent city in Latium, and that they must have gained territory from the Aequi and the Volsci as well, because they, you know, by the middle of the 5th century, they are sitting in a really good position vis-a-vis their neighbors. As these wars were being fought, and largely in sort of collusion with the fighting of wars, the government was developing its institutions. Early on, the most important institution, or the most important body within the government, was known as the Curial Assembly, or the Committee of Kinturyata, is the Latin for that. And the main, and this was, by curial, we mean tribes, because the term in Latin for the tribes was curia, and so these are these, you know, kind of kinship groups we talked about in the last lecture. They came together as part of an assembly, and there were initially 20 of these. There would later, you know, be 31 rural tribes and four urban tribes. And its responsibility was to elect a kind of chief magistrate. And there were always 2 of these. They were known initially as praetors, and you can see that word here. But they later, the name changed sometime in the 5th century to become consul. Now, this can get confusing because there's a later office that's concocted in the first half of the 4th century, which is called praetor. I guess they picked up on that name, the name that had been used before consul did, and turned that into a new office. So not to confuse this earlier office with the later office, so the responsibilities are quite similar. The consul held what it was known as Imperium, which was the power to issue decrees that had the force of law. It's essentially supreme executive authority, right? But as Rome fought all of these wars, they began to organize along military lines. We talked about this when we were discussing the kingdom, that under Servius Tullius, you know, he created this unit of organization known as the century, which was an essential unit of the Roman army, and there were some centuries that were cavalry. Most of them were kind of heavy infantry fighting in the hoplite phalanx, and some of them, that is the ones that had the poorest people who couldn't really afford much by way of arms and armor, they were put into these kind of these centuries that were support troops. Well, as that organization really took shape in the 5th century with the fighting these wars against Rome's neighbors, a new assembly was created that corresponded with the centuries. It was known simply as the Centuriot Assembly, or the Committee of Kinturyata. And at some point in the 5th century, the Centuriot Assembly wrested away, or maybe they just made a decision to do this, wrested away the power to elect the consuls. And so this becomes the chief legislative body, as well as elective, body of electors of executive magistrates in Rome, and it would remain that way for a while. The Curial Assembly would be relegated to rather ritualistic tasks like the granting of Imperium, which was just a kind of formal thing. There was no real decision-making to this or anything like that, right? So the Centuriot Assembly becomes this essential body. It's really the chief legislative group at this point. There is, however, another institution. Now, you're going to realize quite quickly, I think, that the government of the Roman Republic is complex. If you've taken Western Civ from me, maybe you have a sense of this. If you've read anything about Roman history, you'll know that they were obsessed with kind of government organization and the rule of law and things like this, right? And so if you know, hopefully I'm not losing anyone here. You just kind of have to keep everything in front of you and try to figure out which parts of the Roman government have which tasks. Truthfully, it's not any more complex, I think, than the government of the United States or of any modern democracy. They're all pretty complex. But in any case, back to the point here, there is another body called the Senate. And the Senate initially is made up of all of the men who served as consuls, because the term of consul was limited to 1 year. There were always 2 consuls elected in every single year, and the years were identified not by numbers like we do, but by the men who served as consul. And so they would refer to the year that Licinius and Tullius were consuls. Those are the first couple of Roman names I could think of. And everybody would know, oh yeah, that was like 8 years ago, right, or something like that, okay? But after their year as consul, the men who had served in that position would then be part of this thing called the Senate. And this was essentially an august body of elder statesmen who had a lot of government experience, and they would act as advisors to the consuls. They would also weigh in on most of the decisions of the day, and initially, at least until the middle part of the 4th century, the Senate had to give its approval of all of the decisions that were made in the Centuriot Assembly. So they effectively had veto power over any of the legislation coming out of the Committee of Kinturyata. Now, the role of the Senate is going to change to some extent over time, but it's always this body of elder statesmen, usually the wealthiest and most honorable in Rome, and it always has a lot of gravitas, right? And we will talk about the Senate at great length over the course of this term, but just know that its origins are here. It's made up of these men who have served in high positions in government, and it's the most respected body in all of the Roman Republic, and that would remain the case for a while. Now, there's one other aspect of Roman government that we should mention here that's not a common thing, okay? But it was something that came up from time to time, all right? And it actually happened with Cincinnatus, whose picture is shown here, and so we already have a kind of context for this of a time when this might happen. When Rome was faced with a crisis, the consuls, the 2 consuls, could determine to dissolve the government, and I'm sure that they had to have at least the tacit approval of the Senate to do this, but they could dissolve the government and turn all of the government powers over to one individual, one man, because of course government by a dictator, which is the Latin word that they used for this special case, government by a dictator is the most efficient form of government. It doesn't mean it's the best form of government. The potential for corruption and abuse is just endless. But if you really have to get something done, like fight a war that's, where you're in a really desperate situation, or deal with a famine or a shortage of food or something like that, right? If the enemy is literally at the gates, then it might be a good idea, at least the Romans thought it was, to turn everything over to a single individual. However, the Romans did have limitations on the position of dictator. It was supposed to be a 6-month term, after which the previous government would be automatically reconstituted, and the man who had been given the dictatorship would no longer be acknowledged as a dictator. We're going to see in the late Republic, in the 1st century BCE, that this office gets abused by a couple of individuals pretty seriously, and that leads to major changes in the way that Rome works. But we'll put that off until a couple of weeks from now. So hopefully we have a sense of kind of the shape that the government's taking at this point. Legislative power in the hands of the Centuriot Assembly, executive power in the hands of the consuls. This is the Imperium. There are always 2 consuls because they act as a check on each other. After being under the Etruscan kings for a few generations, the Romans were not excited about the prospect of being ruled by a monarch. We saw this in the Livy selection where, Lucius Junius Brutus says, I'm never going to tolerate a king in Rome evermore. And the Romans really felt that way. And that sensibility, that anti-monarchic sensibility continued in Rome. And it's a pretty serious cultural strain there. And so there's always 2 consuls, and their terms are limited to 1 year. But then they become members of the Senate, and the Senate is really where a lot of the decisions get made, even though they didn't have any technical power to make laws. They would often still debate things and advise the consuls, or kind of sway the Centuriot Assembly in one direction or another, right? So the Senate really is tremendously important here. Now, the other source of conflict, I talked about how Rome, fought against its neighbors frequently, and that's a major theme of Republican history. But the other one, and it's arguably even more important, is the conflict within Rome. As early as the 5th century, probably going back even into the period of the kingdom, the Romans had a 2-class social division. And there were nuances to this that the Romans would have understood, but this is a pretty stark division. Sorry for the yawn. For whatever reason, when I'm giving these video lectures, I tend to yawn, so hopefully that's not contagious. Okay, anyway, back to the topic here. The people who had money, and especially honor. Now, I haven't discussed honor at any great length. We saw it come up as a word in the story of the rape of Lucretia, and we'll see it again and again and again. This is a tremendously important concept. And I'll talk about it very soon at some length. But it's essentially reputation, right? Patricians, as they were known, had wealth and they had honor. They gained honor by doing great things for the Republic, and they could. The easiest way to do great things was to spend a lot of money on the Republic, right? Usually serving in some kind of official position while doing so. And so, Patricians is the first division. The other division, which includes everybody else, and this would have included some people who were really quite wealthy and had connections, and some people who were absolutely dirt poor with no connections and no prospects. But this is a wide grouping of people. But this other division are known as plebeians. And the patricians almost certainly date back to the period of the kingdom. These would have been advisors to the king, or people who gained wealth and status during that time. They held they continued to hold that sort of status going forward into the Republic. At times, the patricians allowed more people to enter their ranks. This, by the way, was kept officially in documents because the Romans kept a census every year. They even had government officials known as censors who were responsible for keeping a census. And they would determine, which tribe a person belonged to and which century a person belonged to, and whether one could be enrolled as a patrician or a plebeian in the Roman order, right, as they called it. And as the government was designed, the patricians held all the power. There were limitations, at least the historians tell us there were, on plebeians becoming consuls and thus entering the Senate. The Centuriot Assembly was organized in such a way that most of the centuries, most of the divisions were given to patricians, even though they were a small percentage of the population, probably 10% or less. But they controlled most of the centuries, right, and thus had the power to effectively vote anything into law that they desired. Now, the reality is that we know from other sources that are less biased and less interested in kind of teasing out these themes of conflict, that there were plebeians who gained the office of consul even fairly early on. So we're not sure exactly what to make of this, but we do know from a variety of sources, not just the historians, but even kind of official government documents and things that existed early on, including the 12 Tables, for instance, which is one that I had you read for this week, that the plebeians were pushing for change frequently. Livy tells us, for instance, that in the year, I think it's 494 or 493, that the plebeians decided they were going to leave Rome entirely. And they went out and kind of formed this camp and refused to work and everything, right? So if we look at the Livy there, actually, this is the section, it's page 292 and 293 of the McKendrick and Howe book. He at the top here on 293 on the left-hand side, on the Sacred Mount they established a camp fortified with a palisade and moat, and with no leader in command, equipped only with what they needed to eat, they remained for some days without either making an attack or being attacked, right? So the plebeians just decide, we're going to leave Rome and force the hand of the consuls until, I should say, force the hand of patricians until they give us what we want, which is a greater say in the government. This nearly erupts into open conflict, but then there's a kind of arbiter appointed, a guy who was a patrician but came from plebeian heritage. This, by the way, is a common sort of personality that we find in a lot of the stories of Roman history. We're going to see figures like Marius and Cicero and others later who are known as new men, novus homo, or novi homines. They used to be plebeians, but now they're patricians, but they still kind of have a sense of what the plebeians want. Well, this guy named Menenius Agrippa goes to the plebeians, and he uses this body metaphor where he likens the patricians to the belly of the body. And he says, you might think that the belly just like consumes everything and doesn't give anything to anybody else, but if you don't have the belly, you're going to starve to death, right? It doesn't matter what the arms and the legs and these other things do, and those are, representative of the plebeians. You have to have the belly, otherwise you get no nutrition. And the plebeians then say, oh yeah, we should then go back to Rome, but they do extract this concession from the patricians that they will have this new office, which is called tribune, and I'll explain that in a moment here. Now, whether that, is true to the actual history, we don't know, but Livy, at least captures the kind of conflict that exists at that point. In the 5th century, probably under circumstances similar to what Livy talks about, the plebeians were granted the concession to, first of all, have their own magistrates, and these are known as tribunes. And initially there were either 2 or 5 of these. The sources differ on the number. Later on there are going to be 10 of these. That becomes the kind of standard number of tribunes elected every year. And like the other magistrate positions, the office of tribune lasted only 1 year. Men were not supposed to be able to be elected multiple times to tribune, as they weren't to consul, so there were limitations on this. They also were granted the ability to establish this new legislative body known as the Concilium Plebis. The Council of the Plebeians is really what that means. Now, until the year 287, though that year is even debated because Livy mentions some other years that are possible, but let's go ahead and go with that because I'll talk about it later. The Concilium Plebis issued these laws, which were known as plebiscita, or plebiscites, that until 287 only had power to affect plebeians. Unless the Centuriot Assembly signed off on these, they were limited in power to plebeian matters. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Now, in 287, plebiscita were granted full power of law. But for a while, the powers of the Concilium Plebis seem to have been limited. Now, there was some pushback to this after a renewed round of conflict between patricians and plebeians. There was a group of 10 men known as the Decemviri, and that just means 10 men, appointed, this is around the year 440 something, I think, 445 or something like that, or maybe 450, anyway. And they come up with these written laws, and there are initially 10 of these. Later on, they wrote a couple more. So these are known as the 12 tables. And these, it seems, were somewhat controversial, especially the 2 that were added later to the 10. Even Cicero, who was a relatively conservative fellow, thought that the last 2 tables were terrible laws. And so, we can take a look at... I'm going to have to find this. I apologize. I think I had this pulled up somewhere. Yeah, so here's the 12 tables. Here I am on the Canvas page. So if we go to the 12 tables, we can maybe get a sense of, some of the things that the Romans, were conceiving of in their laws. And we can find in here some efforts on the part, obviously, on the part of patricians to limit the power of the plebeians. Some of these laws are quite brutal, it seems, in their, kind of their social impact. You can look here, for instance, if a father sell his son 3 times, the son shall be free from his father. So fathers had the power under the laws to sell their own children into slavery, it seems. And they could do this up to 3 times, and after the 3rd time, then the son, could proclaim his independence from his father. Another one, a dreadfully deformed child shall be quickly killed. And so like other ancient societies, they really had no ability to deal with people who had severe disabilities, it seems. And so they had a law that, said these children need to be killed. A child born after 10 months since the father's death will not be admitted into a legal inheritance. Well, that's quite obviously because the child is not the legitimate child of the father, right? And so some of these are rather common sense, but there are serious limitations put on the plebeians. This is not the whole document. This is just a selection of things, but this is the one that I provided for you to read. One of the things that's let's see, there was a couple other things that we can talk about. Already the Romans, this is mid-5th century, the Romans are worried about the upkeep of the infrastructure, right? That private individuals who live next to roads are responsible for keeping the road in order. And so this is one of the duties that they have to the Republic, is to make sure that, there are good roads that people can get through. And we've got some property rights dealt with here and things like that. Regulation on funerals and things. This, it seems, this is in Table 11. And like I said, the Tables 11 and 12 seem to have been the most controversial, and some of these laws were later overturned. Table 11 stated right at the beginning that marriages should not take place between plebeians and patricians. This was later overturned, so we can see in the works of the Decemviri here, in the 12 tables, an effort on the part of the patricians to shore up their power and to limit what the plebeians had access to, right? So this is a kind of backlash against the concessions that were granted to the plebeians earlier on in that century. Okay, I don't want to belabor the point too much. Let's talk a little bit about some of these external conflicts now, and then we can return at the end to a discussion of internal workings. In the early 4th century, and actually this war goes all the way back to the early 5th century, it's kind of on again, off again for about 100 years, the Romans were fighting a war against what remained the most prominent city in Etruria among the Etruscans, and this was the city of Veii. You have to pronounce both of those I's. And the hero in this, as Livy tells it, was a guy named Camillus. And Camillus was, kind of went down in history as one of the most admired of all early Romans, though the stories about him are quite obviously legendary, right? So there's a kernel of truth, perhaps, to this, but a lot added to that. Long story short, the Romans, after several periods of warfare and truce, won a decisive victory over Veii in the year 396. And this effectively made Rome the master of not only Latium at this point, but also a significant part of Etruria. And Rome, they destroyed the city of Veii, and the land was distributed to the Roman people. And so there's a real expansion of territory here. But it's right after that, and I mean literally within 10 years, that a group of these Gauls, now the Gauls were probably Celtic peoples who had moved into the area of northern Italy, probably in the Po River Valley, with the collapse of Etruscan power there. And the Gauls were going to be around for a while. Well, they attacked Rome around the year 390, and the way the Roman historians interpret this is the Romans kind of got too high and mighty. They were guilty of hubris, and this was a divine punishment. The gods were not happy with the Romans, but the Gauls ended up seizing the city of Rome itself. And the Romans were unable to do anything militarily about this, and so they offered a tribute of 1,000 pounds of gold to the Gauls to get them to leave Rome. And so that's that's probably a legendary story, but this just goes to show that the Romans did not sort of march inexorably from one great victory to another. That one of the key characteristics of Rome, in fact, was its ability to bounce back from defeat. And they do this repeatedly all through the early period of the Republic. We can even see this in the period of the Punic Wars and other things, right? So that flexibility and adaptability and, this bounce back characteristic is an essential feature of kind of the Roman story. So after this defeat by the Gauls, they put into place a number of changes that would hopefully mitigate any future defeats. And in fact, the city of Rome is never taken again for about 800 years. And that's one of Rome's great claims to fame is the city itself. Even though sometimes they were besieged, they never fell from the year 387 until the year 410, the year 387 BCE till the year 410 CE. The city of Rome itself is never taken militarily. Of course, there are civil wars and things like that, but those don't count, I guess. And one of the reasons is, at this point, they build stone walls around the city, a network, and these are attributed to the Etruscan king Servius Tullius, but these are probably this later edition, early 4th century walls, rather than something that happened in the 6th century as they were purported to be. They also make military reforms. Now, the date of these is not clear. It may have happened after the defeat by the Gauls, or it may have happened during the Samnite Wars. But the Romans shift away from the hoplite phalanx to a different military formation known as the Maniple. Now, the picture that you see here is a kind of workup of the Maniple. The first thing you should note here is that the shield is no longer round. It's now rectangular and long, and it's more maneuverable. This shield would have been much lighter than the hoplite shield. The other thing that you should note here is that the soldiers are not packed together shoulder to shoulder, and that the main offensive weapon of the Maniple is a short sword rather than a long spear. Now, how did this work exactly? Well, the Maniple was a flexible formation where the soldiers were given several feet of space before the next soldier so that they could maneuver. They could flank, they could sort of fan out across the battlefields, they could, they're not packed together so tightly that they can't maneuver the entire formation. They can adapt to different terrain, different conditions. They could get in closer, and fight with the sword rather than relying almost entirely on this massive shield, and once the shield wall was broken, then they had no hope, right? So the Maniple is an essential characteristic of the Roman military from this point on, really for the next several hundred years. This is the key to Roman military success. There's a really great depiction, by the way, of the Maniple in the film Spartacus, the 1960 film starring Kirk Douglas and Laurence Olivier. I would recommend, as I said, I've offered extra credit if you watch a film and write a review of it. I would highly recommend Spartacus, and take a look especially at this scene of a battle where, you know, the Romans deploy the Maniple, and you can kind of see how it works. Now, the Latin League revolted in the year 341, and pause for the yawn. This led to another round of warfare with their neighbors, which the Romans won, and they effectively dissolved the Latin League at this point. But they did make a calculation that if they extended privileges to their Latin neighbors, that, you know, they would win them over and no longer have to deal with the threat of the Latins, right? So they ended up extending in the 330s citizenship to several other cities, which came to be incorporated into this larger Roman hegemony, right? And men from those cities were henceforth eligible to participate in Roman politics, even to run for office and things like this, right? So Rome has already begun its long history of incorporating other peoples, though that's, of course, going to be a major debate in many cases, over what to do with conquered populations. Now, arguably, the most important wars that Rome fought in the first 2 centuries of the Republic's existence were the wars against the Samnites. I mentioned, let me go back to an earlier slide here. The Samnites were people who lived kind of here in central Italy in the Apennine Mountains. The Latins were the people who lived just immediately south of Rome on Latium, right, kind of in that region, and so forth and so on. Okay, so so the Samnites are further inland here, and these are mountain people, and they were hardy, and they were, you know, effective warriors, at least according to the Roman, you know, historical sources that we have. And Rome fought a series of 3 wars against them. Now, I'm not going to go into lots of detail here. We simply don't have the time to do that. But in the first 2 wars, the Romans were defeated pretty soundly in the first one. The second one ended up as a stalemate. In the third one, the Romans ended up defeating not only the Samnites, but the Samnites had made an alliance with some Gauls, and they tried to kind of a 2-pronged attack against the Romans, and this didn't happen, and the Romans pushed them back into the Apennines, and ended up defeating the Samnites and extracting from them a concession that Rome would have sort of free reign to govern the territory of the Apennine Mountains, that the Samnites would become subject peoples. Now, the Samnites were not happy about this, and we're going to see that, you know, they expressed their unhappiness later on during the Punic Wars, but ultimately they were incorporated into the larger Roman polity. It's probably during the Samnite Wars that the Maniple takes shape as the main mechanism for fighting for the Romans. Because fighting on mountainous terrain, fighting on the unevenness of hills, is probably what prompted the need to shift battlefield strategies or battlefield formations. A Maniple is going to be way more effective on uneven terrain than a tightly packed phalanx, which relies on people staying together. If you've got, you know, if you've got hills, it's just going to be almost impossible to maintain a phalanx, and that leaves it open to counterattacks and flanking and finding weaknesses in it and things like that, right? So the Samnite Wars are key to Roman adaptability on the battlefield and its future identity as the military juggernaut of the world, right? It's probably due to these repeated wars against the Samnites that the Romans also start to build other things that become essential to its operation. So there is a war, during one of these wars, the Romans construct a road down, through Latium into Campania, so the road south from Rome itself. This is known as the Appian Way, and is kind of the master road of the Roman road system, which will grow to become this gigantic thing extending all through its empire eventually, right? It's called the Appian Way because it's named after the censor from that period. One of the responsibilities of the censors was to see to the upkeep of the infrastructure of Rome, including roads, and so this guy's name was Appius Claudius Caecus. Caecus, interestingly, means the blind one, and so he may have been blind. It's uncertain. But the Appian Way is kind of the first Roman effort to build effective roads. This is a paved road, probably with stones, not with any, what we would think of as paving. So cobblestones or gravel or something like that. But a road that, gives Rome the permanent ability to move goods and troops and things like this quickly into different regions, and the Appian Way would have been essential to get soldiers from Rome into Campania and from there into the Apennines to fight against the Samnites. Now, maybe the most important consequence, I know I tend toward the superlative, by the way, that's one of my quirks. Not everything can be the greatest or the most important or anything like that, so I apologize if this gets confusing. I try not to do that, but this truly is really, really important. One of the most important consequences of war, how about that? We'll hedge a little bit, is what's known as the Lex Hortensia. Now, what prompted this is that plebeians were often conscripted because the patricians are too few in number to fight these wars themselves. They would conscript the larger population of Rome, including mostly plebeian soldiers. These soldiers were not paid very well. They were supposed to serve because it was a duty to serve. Because the plebeians really didn't have much of a say in the making of laws or the prosecution of wars, those responsibilities were given entirely to the Committee of Kinturyata, which was dominated by the Patricians. And even though the tribunes had kind of veto power over decisions made by the consuls or the Centuriot Assembly, one tribune could block the efforts of other tribunes, and so the patricians could kind of buy off one tribune and nullify that threat, right? So the plebeians really didn't have the ability to say no to this or to protest or anything like that. And so as a consequence of these wars, the plebeians, probably by some means of protest and threats and other things, end up extracting from the Centuriot Assembly these concessions that are known as the Hortensian Law, or the Lex Hortensia. The two key components of the Lex Hortensia are, first, that the plebiscites, that is, the decrees of the plebeian council, the Concilium Plebis, had the force of law the same as if they were issued by the Centuriot Assembly. Okay, and so that's huge, right? Now the plebeian assembly can make laws. The other one is that the tribunes were given Imperium. And so now tribunes, these plebeian office holders, can issue decrees that have the force of law, essentially similar to what the consuls did. Now, that said, there were a lot of limitations or challenges to that. As I said, there were 10 tribunes, and any one tribune could issue Imperium decrees, but other tribunes could then step in and issue Imperium decrees that nullified the one of their colleague, right? So their power was still somewhat limited, and the patricians could easily buy off the tribunes by possibly offering them a position among the patricians or something like that. There were different means of this, and many holders of the office of tribune, were pretty ambitious and wanted to seek even higher office, like consul later on. And so, this... but nevertheless, despite those challenges and limitations, the Lex Hortensia is a move toward what we might call democracy. Now, Rome is never at any point a democracy. It does, however, merge elements of democracy, that is, popular government, through things like the Plebeian Assembly, mixes that with these more privileged kinds of government institutions like position of consul, the whole system of the cursus honorum, the system of magistrates as it's called, which we will discuss later on. Okay. Now, the other consequence of winning the wars against the Samnites are that the Romans now effectively have hegemony over Italy. Everything up to the point where the Greek poleses take over, really all the way down to Magna Graecia, right? So Tuscany or Etruria is now in the hands of the Romans, as is Latium, as is Campania, as are the regions of the Apennine Mountains. So Rome now can have access to eastern Italy as well. The Romans are becoming the most important force in all of Italy at this point, and they're going to extend that over the course of the 3rd century into the Western Mediterranean, in the 2nd century into the Eastern Mediterranean, and by the end of the 1st century, we're going to have the Roman Empire, right? But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We've still got a couple of weeks to talk about the Republic, and frankly, I think the Republic is more interesting than the Empire, so hopefully, we enjoy learning about all of that. I think I'm going to stop there. I do want to go into some detail about the structures of the Roman government, but I think I'm going to save that for the next lecture and only make you responsible for this much at this point.